Leonardo had always dreamed of living in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. After years of working hard in the tech industry, he finally found a charming, small apartment in a predominantly white, upscale neighborhood. It was his chance to live somewhere peaceful, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. His excitement was palpable as he carried in boxes, setting up his new life with optimism and determination. However, that optimism would soon be challenged by his neighbor, Karen, who lived next door. Leonardo had heard about her through the grapevine. She was known in the area as a bit of a busybody, someone who was always too involved in the lives of those around her. She'd been living in the neighborhood for years, and the general sentiment about her was mixed. While her friends described her as friendly, most of the neighbors thought she was a bit overbearing and too controlling. The first interaction with Karen set the stage for what would turn out to be a tense, unpredictable relationship. On his first morning in the new apartment, as Leonardo sat in his living room, unpacking his belongings and setting up his tech gear, he noticed her watching him from her window. He smiled and waved, hoping to break the ice, but Karen didn't wave back. Instead, she seemed to scrutinize him for a moment, then quickly turned away. He dismissed it as a simple moment of misunderstanding, thinking nothing more of it. But little did he know, this was the beginning of a much more complicated dynamic with Karen. A few days later, Leonardo was setting up his Wi-Fi. He had purchased a service plan through the apartment complex's shared network, a typical arrangement in many communities, where tenants shared the same internet connection to cut costs. After logging into the system, he found that the network was slow, and he needed more bandwidth for his work, as he often had to run several devices for tech projects. So, he did what any tech-savvy person would do. He changed the Wi-Fi password and set up his own private network. It was a simple move, one that wouldn't disrupt anyone else but would ensure his work from home would go smoothly. But Karen wasn't so understanding. The next morning, as Leonardo was about to begin his day, he heard a firm knock on his door. He opened it to find Karen standing in the hallway, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. "You've changed the Wi-Fi password, haven't you?" she asked, her tone sharp. Leonardo, taken aback but calm, nodded and explained that it was his right as a resident to change the password, as the network was technically part of his apartment package. "I need you to change it back right now," Karen insisted, her voice growing louder. "This is my internet, and you have no right to mess with it." Leonardo, trying to keep the situation from escalating, offered to explain the arrangement and how he had set up his own network for personal use. But Karen wouldn't hear it. She started raising her voice, calling him a thief and accusing him of tampering with her property. The situation quickly escalated when she declared, "I'm calling the police." Leonardo stood his ground, fully aware of his rights, but Karen stormed off to her phone, dialing 911 with a sense of entitlement. "Yes, there's a man trespassing and tampering with my property," she claimed, not bothering to give details beyond that. "He's changed my Wi-Fi password, and I need someone to remove him from my apartment immediately." As Karen spoke with the dispatcher, Leonardo had no choice but to wait. He knew the situation would be resolved quickly, but the racial undertones of Karen's complaint hung in the air like a dark cloud. Karen's voice shook with a mix of frustration and self-righteousness as she relayed her version of events to the 911 dispatcher. She left out crucial details, like the fact that Leonardo was a paying resident of the building and had every right to change his Wi-Fi password. Instead, she exaggerated, painting him as a dangerous intruder. "He doesn't even live here," she claimed, though she had no idea where he actually came from. "He's a stranger, and he's using my Wi-Fi without permission. He refuses to leave my property." The dispatcher, who sounded slightly confused but calm, assured Karen that officers would be dispatched immediately. Karen, meanwhile, paced in her apartment, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction in the power she was about to exert. As if calling the police could magically fix the problem, in her mind she felt her control slipping away from her, and this action gave her a sense of authority that she was desperate to hold on to. In the meantime, Leonardo, unfazed by the phone call, simply went back to his apartment, set up his devices, and continued his day. He knew what Karen was doing wasn't right, but he wasn't going to let it ruin his peace. His mind wandered to the absurdity of the situation. How could she be this bothered over a Wi-Fi password? The worst part was the way she had involved the police over something so trivial, perhaps because of some deeper prejudices lurking beneath her surface. Moments later, the sound of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the officers. The two police officers walked up to Leonardo's apartment, their uniforms stiff and their expressions unreadable. Leonardo opened the door and greeted them with a calm but firm demeanor, ready to explain the situation. Karen, standing behind them, was already eager to speak her piece, but the officers held up a hand for her to wait. "What's going on here, sir?" one of the officers asked, looking at Leonardo. He explained that he had simply changed the Wi-Fi password for his apartment's shared network, and that Karen had no right to interfere with that. The officer nodded, seemingly understanding the situation, but Karen immediately jumped in. "This man has stolen my Wi-Fi and refuses to leave!" she shouted, pointing at Leonardo. "He's trespassing, and he's tampering with my property!" The officers exchanged a quick glance, their skepticism growing. It was clear that the situation didn't add up. One of the officers asked Karen, "How do you know he's tampering with your Wi-Fi?" Karen hesitated, fumbling for a response. "He changed my password," she said. "I had it set up perfectly. It's my Wi-Fi. He shouldn't be able to do that." The officer turned back to Leonardo. "Is that correct?" Leonardo calmly replied, "Yes, it is. I'm the tenant here, and I have the right to change my own Wi-Fi settings, including the password. It's no different than setting up cable or utilities." The officer paused, visibly processing the information. Karen's accusation seemed more and more groundless by the second. Finally, the officer looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, we're sorry, but this is a civil matter. There's nothing illegal about him changing the Wi-Fi password." Karen's face flushed red as the officers apologized to Leonardo for the inconvenience. They warned her not to make any more baseless claims. As the officers turned to leave, Karen stood in stunned silence, the power she had once felt over the situation slipping away. Her mistake was now clear to everyone, but the damage had already been done. As the officers walked away, Leonardo couldn't help but wonder how long Karen had been using her privilege to control and manipulate people. After the chaotic 911 incident with Karen, Leonardo found himself feeling both frustrated and unsettled. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a Wi-Fi password, it was about something deeper. Something that seemed to tap into an undercurrent of prejudice and entitlement that he couldn't quite place. Why had Karen reacted so aggressively to something so trivial? With his background in tech, Leonardo was well versed in the digital tools available to him, and he knew how to access public records. His curiosity turned into determination as he decided to dig deeper into Karen's life, hoping to understand the root of her behavior. Using a combination of social media profiles, online databases, and his advanced tech knowledge, Leonardo began his investigation. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he suspected that there might be more to Karen's animosity than met the eye. It didn't take long before he found some troubling information. At first, the search was mundane. Karen had lived in the area for several years, was active on a few community boards, and had a spotless public persona. But the deeper he dug, the more disturbing patterns started to emerge. There were multiple complaints filed against her, most of them from tenants and properties she had managed as a real estate agent. These complaints, however, hadn't garnered much attention, at least not in the public sphere. A few quick phone calls to the local tenants' union confirmed that many of these issues had been quietly swept under the rug, dismissed due to Karen's connections within the community. As Leonardo pieced together the puzzle, he discovered a dark underbelly to Karen's career. She had been involved in a number of shady business deals, particularly ones that targeted vulnerable, predominantly black communities. Karen had been leveraging her position as a real estate agent to exploit the very people she seemed to harbor disdain for. She had been accused of driving up rental prices in already struggling neighborhoods, forcing out families who could no longer afford to live in their own homes. On top of that, many of the properties she had worked with were in disrepair, leaky roofs, faulty plumbing, and broken appliances, but she would still rent them out at exorbitant prices. Leonardo also uncovered a deeper layer of racial discrimination tied to these practices. Karen's business model wasn't just about making money, it was about further segregating communities and driving up profits at the expense of the people she was supposed to serve. She'd been accused of refusing to rent to black families and only approving white tenants for better units. The more Leonardo uncovered, the more disgusted he became. As he sat back and reviewed the information, Leonardo realized that Karen's behavior wasn't just a one-off incident, it was a long-standing pattern of discrimination, deceit, and exploitation. The confrontation he had with her now felt even more necessary. He knew that exposing Karen for who she truly was could lead to real consequences. This wasn't just about protecting his own dignity. This was about holding her accountable for her actions that had harmed so many. Armed with the information he had gathered, Leonardo decided it was time to confront Karen, not in a heated, reactionary way, but with cold, hard facts that would expose her for what she truly was. He carefully planned his approach, deciding to visit her house under the pretense of discussing the Wi-Fi password incident. But he wasn't going to let this go without making her aware of the consequences of her actions. As he knocked on her door, Leonardo's heart raced. He had no idea how Karen would react, but he knew one thing for sure: this moment would change everything. When she answered the door, her expression shifted between surprise and annoyance, as if she wasn't quite prepared for a visit. But Leonardo remained calm, his voice steady as he addressed her. "Karen, I came by to discuss the incident with the Wi-Fi." He started, his words measured but firm. She immediately tried to dismiss him, muttering something about how it was no big deal, and that they should just move on. But Leonardo wasn't here to talk about Wi-Fi anymore. "I've spent some time looking into your past, Karen," he continued, his tone now carrying a weight that made her pause. "What I found wasn't pretty." Karen's face immediately changed from defensive to wary. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice sharp, though it trembled ever so slightly. Leonardo didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened his phone and showed her a series of screenshots, public records detailing complaints from previous tenants. The records painted a disturbing picture of her real estate dealings, her name tied to multiple accusations of exploitation, rental scams, and blatant racial discrimination. As Karen's eyes flicked from one document to the next, her defensiveness started to falter. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though her voice wavered. Leonardo wasn't done yet. He pressed forward, showing her more evidence, emails from former tenants describing broken promises and damaged properties, testimonials from families who had been pushed out of their homes because they couldn't afford to live under the terms she had set. As he read excerpts aloud, her confidence began to crack. Karen tried to spin it, claiming that the accusations were misunderstandings, and that her actions had been taken out of context. But Leonardo had done his homework, and the evidence was irrefutable. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said, his voice cold now. "You've been exploiting vulnerable people for years. You've been using your position to perpetuate racial inequality and harm communities that are already struggling." Karen's face flushed a deep red, her eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the situation. For the first time, she seemed vulnerable, as though the world she had carefully constructed around herself was slipping away. You can't do this," she stammered. "I've worked hard for everything I have. This is just lies." Leonardo didn't flinch. "It's all right here, Karen," he said, pointing to the documents on his phone. "This isn't just one incident. This is years of manipulation, discrimination, and exploitation. You've built your entire career on hurting others." As Karen stood there speechless, her face pale and her mouth hanging open, the reality of the situation began to hit her. She tried to deny everything, but each new piece of evidence left her with fewer defenses. The weight of her actions hung heavy in the air. She realized, in that moment, that everything she had worked for, her status in the community, her career, her image, was about to crumble. The more she tried to brush it off, the more her facade unraveled. Her carefully cultivated life was coming to an end, and she knew it. There was no way out this time. The truth was out, and Leonardo wasn't going to let her hide behind lies anymore. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Karen to face the consequences of her actions, consequences that would destroy her life in ways she never anticipated. After Leonardo's confrontation with Karen, he knew that the truth needed to be shared with the world. He had the power of technology at his fingertips, and he wasn't going to let her actions go unpunished. Using social media platforms, Leonardo started to release the evidence he had meticulously gathered. He posted screenshots, public records, and testimonies, each piece more damning than the last. What started as a few simple tweets quickly gained momentum. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it became a nationwide scandal. Karen's carefully curated public persona was shattered in a matter of hours. People began to scrutinize her every move, and soon, her past indiscretions were exposed in excruciating detail. Her involvement in racist and discriminatory real estate practices was broadcast across social media, drawing in support from the very communities she had harmed. As the news spread, Karen became the face of corporate corruption and racial exploitation. Articles were written about her unethical business dealings, highlighting the ways she had preyed on vulnerable families to increase her wealth. The media spotlight revealed the true nature of her work, inflating rental prices, targeting black families with discriminatory policies, and neglecting to maintain properties she rented out. Soon, the personal side of Karen's life became just as toxic. Her social media accounts were flooded with hate messages from people who had followed her career but now saw her as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. People who had once praised her for her status now turned on her, publicly denouncing her actions and demanding accountability. The online backlash was swift and brutal, leaving Karen with nowhere to hide. Her reputation as a pillar of the community vanished in an instant. The fallout from the exposure was immediate and far-reaching. Karen's career as a real estate agent came to a screeching halt. She was promptly fired from her job, and all the powerful connections she had built over the years disassociated themselves from her. The company that had employed her quickly issued a public statement denouncing her actions and explaining that she no longer represented their values. Within days, her name was removed from the company's website, and the real estate firm began the process of distancing itself from the scandal. But the consequences didn't stop there. The tenants she had wronged over the years began to find their voices. Former clients and residents of the neighborhood she had exploited filed lawsuits against her for discrimination, violation of tenant rights, and negligence. Some tenants who had been forced out of their homes shared their stories with the media, detailing the harassment and unfair treatment they had endured under Karen's management. Karen's personal life became the subject of relentless online scrutiny. Photos of her expensive lifestyle were juxtaposed with the stories of families who had been displaced due to her greed. The people she had once considered beneath her now stood as the moral arbiters, pointing out every flaw in her character. Karen became the subject of internet memes, and her once adoring followers turned into harsh critics. The backlash was relentless, and as Karen saw her friends and colleagues abandon her, she realized that the life she had built was crumbling before her eyes. Her wealth and status had once shielded her from the harsh realities faced by the people she exploited. But now, her past sins were catching up with her in full force. The people she had mistreated were finally having their voices heard, and Karen had no way to fight back. While the fallout from Karen's exposure continued, Leonardo felt a quiet sense of justice. He had faced a system that had tried to belittle him, but he had taken matters into his own hands and brought the truth to light. For Leonardo, this wasn't just about personal vengeance. It was about bringing attention to the inequities that so many had suffered in silence. His actions had not only hurt Karen's life but also sparked a wider conversation about the exploitation of marginalized communities. But Leonardo wasn't done. The power he had gained through his investigation and the exposure of Karen's wrongdoings presented an opportunity to do more than just watch someone's life unravel. He decided to use his newfound influence to give back to the communities that Karen had exploited for so long. He started funding housing initiatives aimed at providing affordable and safe housing to marginalized communities. He partnered with local organizations that worked to help families who had been affected by housing discrimination, ensuring they had access to legal aid and resources to fight back against predatory practices. Leonardo's work became a beacon of hope, showing that justice could be achieved through persistence and dedication. He spoke at community events and became an advocate for social justice, amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced by people like Karen. His actions set an example for others who might find themselves in similar situations, encouraging them to stand up for what was right. Karen, on the other hand, was left with nothing. Once the epitome of privilege, she now faced the consequences of her actions. Her wealth was gone, her reputation in tatters, and her career shattered. She moved out of the neighborhood that had once catered to her every whim, her personal belongings a reminder of the life she had once lived. The home that had once been a symbol of her success now felt like a hollow shell, and the community she had once been a part of no longer welcomed her. As she packed her things, Karen couldn't help but reflect on the choices she had made. She had spent so many years exploiting others, building her life on the backs of vulnerable families, and using her privilege to maintain a facade of respectability. But in the end, the truth had caught up with her, and there was no escaping the damage she had done. Leonardo, on the other hand, stood firm in the knowledge that he had made a difference. He had fought back against a system that tried to silence him, and had turned the tables on those who thought they could use power and privilege to harm others. As he looked out over the community he had worked so hard to help, a sense of peace washed over him. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered in silence for far too long. And in doing so, he had brought justice to those who needed it most.